I'm going to talk to you about the different ways to get watercolor down on your paper. We have wet into wet, wet into dry, dry brushing, flat washes. Then I will also show you radiated washes, how to get a beautiful, nice background for it. Could be a landscape, it could be for a portrait or anything like that. These are the basic ways to get watercolor down on your paper. One of the first techniques I'm going to teach you how to get your paint down is wet into wet. So I come into my water, coming into the water, I'm tapping that a little bit. You can also add a little bit to a cloth or paper towel to touch up a little bit more if not, but it's always learning how to control the water, I think, is one of the biggest challenges. People usually add too much water and it comes up too thin. So what I'm doing right now is I'm applying clear water on my paper. Now watch how I'm like a pendulum. I'm going back and forth, having nice even strokes in one direction, and then I go in the opposite direction just to make sure that you're not missing. It's very, you don't have color on your brush, so you can easily miss a chunk and you're not going to get a nice wash if you are missing a section of getting that paper wet. So I go back and forth. Notice how I've taped all around my paper. I've got it nice and secure on a support board. I've got the area wet. There's all different degrees of how wet you get that paper. You do not want to soak it, but I did a nice back and forth. This should be fine. The fibers are now starting to open up, get ready to absorb the pigment. I come now in and I'm going to grab my cobalt blue. I'm going to add two colors into the wet process because it just makes it a little more exciting, I think. I get my brush nice and loaded and I'm going to come in and drop in the color. This is a great way when I do clouds. You can see now I'm picking actually my paper up and I'm letting it mingle and move. I'm going to have fun and come in with the rose madder and I'm going to drop in another color. Look at that. Oh, it's just beautiful. This is what makes watercolor so fun. If I hold it flat, it moves in a different direction, which may be fine. It depends what you're trying to accomplish, but this is a beautiful wet into wet process. I'm also going to show you a wet into wet. That was picking up the paper and letting it mingle. I'm now going to work very flat. My brush was a little bit dirty there, you can see. That's okay. Now I'm just going to come in and I'm going to do wet into wet. I'm going to put down, working flat. I'm putting down a color. Wet into wet has beautiful soft edges because you're working on wet paper. See how it just moves on its own? I'm going to try now a smaller brush to show you. Coming in and laying it down. So you can add, and it crawls and mingles. But this is soft edges, wet into wet. That's working flat. That's when you get it moving by picking it up. Two different ways to work wet into wet. Make sure that you're cleaning up your edges so you don't get a backflow on that. But it's a wonderful way to do backgrounds, different soft edges when you're working wet into wet. Wet into dry is meaning that you have a wet brush and dry paper. So you just come in and when you're working wet into wet, it's a looser style, you have less control, but when you're working wet into dry, you have dry paper, so you can make exact very exact movement with your brush. So you're not using water to flow. It just, you can get very, and I say play with your brush, see what different marks your brush can do, but this is dry, wet into dry. So you can do a nice flat wash, wet into dry. You can load up your brush, and this is called dry brushing. Your brush actually runs out of pigment. So this is any time you apply one color, or we can even add a second color in there. I'll take some cobalt blue. We can add a second color in there. That's fine, as long as it's wet. You're not going to get a bloom. This has a lot more control when you're handling wet on dry paper. So these are great techniques to practice. And that is wet onto dry.